When we come back, why so many people love the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas is not only one of the most famous Catholic thinkers, but his ideas have received more support from the institutional church than any other in modern times. Before the Second Vatican Council, when men were trained for the priesthood, they were trained in the ideas of the angelic doctor more than anyone else. Why? Well, one reason, and probably the main reason, was that Aquinas had the gift of presenting a powerfully unified vision of reality in which all things fit together, with God at the very centre. A reality which was not only knowable to mankind, but capable of being expressed in word as well. Many people think Thomas was a follower of Aristotle. It's true, of course, that he thought so highly of Aristotle that he nicknamed him the philosopher. But a deeper appreciation of Aquinas reveals that he liked Plato too, particularly the Christian Platonism that he acquired following the lead of St. Augustine and Pseudo-Dionysius, both of whom had written centuries before him. How did Aquinas put Plato and Aristotle together? Remember that the major difference between Plato and Aristotle revolved around Plato's theory of forms or ideals. Where were these forms? When we think of a dog which participates in the form or ideal of dogness, this form transcends actual dogs, and for Plato would exist in some way even if there were no dogs to participate in it. Aristotle, on the other hand, realised you just can't have an ideal floating around somewhere without a mind to think of it. For Aristotle, the ideals of things like dogs were located only in actual dogs. The human mind abstracts the ideal of dogness from encounters with real dogs. If there were no dogs, there would be no ideal of dog to abstract. This was Aristotle's solution to the problem. The ideal of the thing exists only in the actual thing. But another answer to the problem of the homeless Platonic ideals was possible, and this answer was suggested by Augustine. The ideal of dogness, indeed all the ideals of any actual existing thing, as well as any potential not yet existing thing, existed eternally in the mind of God. In the divine intellect, the divine ideas existed in a transcendent way that Plato had proposed. In this way, the ideal of dogness would exist in the mind of God even if there were no actual dogs to approximate it. Both of these metaphysical systems had certain strengths. Aristotle's was practical, empirical, and depended on encounter with real things in lived experience. Augustine's refined Platonism was idealistic, God-centered, and established a permanent, intrinsic connection between the goodness of God and all the good things in the world. The genius of St. Thomas Aquinas combined both of these notions into one. How does the vision of Aquinas work? Well, when God creates something, he first has the idea of what he wants to create in his intellect from all eternity. How does the vision of Aquinas work? Well, when God creates something, he first has the idea of what he wants to create in his intellect from all eternity. Now, there is a very important caveat to all this that I have to point out. God is a creator by his own free will. He is not, I repeat, not a creator by nature. If he were a creator by nature, he would have to create. He would simply turn, and all created things would flow out of him like an unceasing geyser. The created order would not be very orderly at all, but would ooze uncontrollably from God, the first principle. In this way, all things created would be part of God, and God would be present in the makeup of all things. This is the classic error of emanationism, a form of pantheism, in which the world is simply an extension of God, who by nature must flow endlessly into it. Many followers of Plato, such as Plotinus, taught a version of this theory. And it is wrong because God is not part of the world and the world is not made up of parts of God. When God created the world, the creation added nothing to His glory. This is why God's Sabbath rest is so essential for St. Thomas Aquinas' metaphysical understanding of creation. By showing that God could rest, that He could freely stop creating on the seventh day, it confirmed that the creative act was a free choice, not something God had to do by nature. This is an essential metaphysical truth of the creation. God is not part of the creation, and the creation is not an extension of God. Creation is an act of the will. It is a loving self-communication of God who is personal. In a particular way of understanding, we can say that God has only one idea, the divine word. But when it comes to creation, Aquinas explains that God has the ideas of all created and creatable things, which are diverse and limited ways that creatures imitate the divine word. St. Thomas says, in the divine mind, there are exemplar forms of all creatures, which are called ideas, as there are forms of artifacts in the mind of an artisan. This is akin to a builder who has the idea of a house in his mind before he sets to work on the building. In addition, the builder has the ideas of all the parts of the house and how to order them together for the good of the whole house. In a similar and higher way, before He creates, God has in His divine mind the ideas of the whole universe, all its parts, and how these parts fit together for the order of the whole universe. Anyway, let's take what Aquinas did and run with it, shall we? God creates something like a simple rock. This humble little rock began as an idea in God's mind. God's intellect envisioned a possible rock, and then God willed the rock into being. The rock went forth from God, so to speak, as it moved from a mere potentiality toward actuality. It exited from God as it began its journey into actual existence, and then moved by God into whatever it is right now. God knows and wills from all eternity everything this little rock was and everything that it right now is, including the fact that it is now playing a supporting role in a YouTube video. This is the journey of a rock away from God, so to speak, the exitus. But the journey of the rock is not yet complete. God not only knows and wills from all eternity what the rock is now, but what the rock will be when it achieves its full perfection, its final cause. The rock strives and may take years to reach the final purpose that God willed for it. Maybe it will end up in the ocean and get polished and nice and shiny due to the waves. Maybe it will get crushed into a foundation for a highway. Or maybe it will just linger on the ground as long as our planet Earth remains. As the rock achieves the perfection God wills for it, it returns to God, so to speak, as it imitates more and more the rock ideal or idea in God's intellect. This return is called the reditus. The return journey is not like departure from God, because the rock's coming into being is not the same as achieving the fulfillment of the rock's nature and ultimate purpose. The exitus from God is not the same as the reditus back to God. The journey is not linear but circular. For the rock, as with all things, God is its beginning and its end, the Alpha and the Omega. Now, if we can imagine the dynamism that exists in the life of a lowly rock on its circular journey away from and back to its loving Creator, how much more can we see human existence as that same sort of journey? How? Well, let's look at it in the most pedestrian way. I am holding here an apple. I see the apple. I see what it is. I abstract the form of the apple from my sense knowledge to make it now present in my intellect. But the form or idea of this piece of fruit existed first in the intellect of God, who thought it from all eternity. My idea of the apple, therefore, creates a union of solidarity between my intellect and God's. I think God's thoughts after him. But not only this, I see that the apple is good insofar as it exists. I mean, it could be better than it is perhaps, but it is still good in that it exists. And it is good for me. It looks appetizing and it tastes pretty good too. But I know that the goodness of the apple comes only from God. The apple participates in God's goodness. It imitates God insofar as it conforms to the ideal of apple in God's intellect. God has moved the apple to approach its own perfection, which exists eternally in God's own mind. When I choose the apple as good, as desirable, I am implicitly willing God as well. Because in seeing the apple as good for me, and in choosing that goodness, I am choosing my own perfection, which again exists in God's intellect and in some way in my own intellect. I continue my own return to God. Seen from God's point of view, he thought of me and the apple and willed both of us into being. Both me and the apple thus come from God. As we each move toward our own perfections according to our respective natures, we each return to God. Since I have an intellect and a will, my return to God is more profound than the apple. My nature is better than the apple, and so my perfection is better, and my likeness to God is greater. Still, all things in this way have an exitus and a reditus, a departure from God and a return to him. And since the journey back to God is not like the departure from God, it was most natural to envision the movement as a circular one, the circle being the most perfect and symmetrical of all shapes. But of course, it takes a great deal of metaphysical imagination to fully perceive Aquinas' powerful unified vision of all reality, a vision that combines the best of Plato and Aristotle without some grounding in the basic ideas of these ancient Greeks. The unified vision scarcely makes sense at all. And there is another problem that Aquinas perceived, a problem that Christian revelation alone elucidated. Human beings suffer from original sin. And among other things, this means concupiscence, a darkening of the intellect and a weakening of the will. We can only see that the goodness of the apple relates to the ultimate goodness of God very faintly, and even then, only under the best of circumstances. But the darkening of the intellect caused by original sin means that we usually cannot perceive this at all. And the darkening of the intellect sometimes even means that we fail to see the highest good. And the things that we do see and desire as good are in reality not very good for us at all. To make matters worse, even when we do accurately perceive the highest and greatest good, our weakened will may not provide the strength to actually choose that thing. Added to the problem of concupiscence is the problem of the return to God itself. You see, simply by eating the apple, we don't in fact get very far on the journey. And we learn from divine revelation, in fact, that the perfection that God envisioned for us is nothing less than divine sonship itself, blessed communion in God's inner life, in his Trinitarian family. This would imply a return that is an infinitely large journey to complete. It would not be possible for our finite intellects and wills to achieve it. We need supernatural help. We need, as the letter to the Hebrews points out, a pioneer and perfecter who could not only blaze the trail for our return, but empower our return, which requires that we undergo and pass the tests that Jesus Christ himself did. Aquinas was not the first to think of a great circle of exitus and reditus, nor the first to envision the human person as a traveller on that great metaphysical journey. But Aquinas' contribution not only unified the metaphysical systems of Plato and Aristotle, but also showed another way in which the revelation of Jesus Christ elevated and perfected and even completed the hopes of the very best ancient philosophy. Indeed, Aquinas masterfully wove the metaphysical exitus and reditus of the ancient Greeks together with a narrative of salvation history, the mysteries of creation, the fall, incarnation, redemption, and glorification.